today we're going to be covering maps, games, and morality, which gives us a lot that we can touch on. I'm looking forward to learning a lot from three luminaries, Adrian, Andie, and Liz. I think we're starting off with Adrian, who is going to wow us all by having no slides. Hi, Adrian.
No, I think actually it's Liz was supposed to go first, wasn't it?
Oh, my apologies, and I'm not.
I'm happy to go in either order, whatever makes the most sense.
I guess, anyway, that was what it said. Let's just start with Liz, and then I'll do the middle, and then.
Sure, that sounds great. Kind of continuous iteration, right? Like we have to learn things as we go. Great. All right. Why don't I share my screen, and hopefully people can confirm that they can see my screen. Yes, give me a thumbs up. Wonderful. So, hi, I'm Liz Fong-Jones, and I am a principal developer advocate and site reliability engineer at a company called Honeycomb.io. We're in the DevOps space, and we help companies better understand their complex software systems. But that's not what I'm here to talk about today. Well, I'll talk about it a little bit. This is not where I started, though, so let's kind of chart the path towards how I wound up where I am today. So 16 years ago, I came out to my biological family and I was disowned, and I didn't have a lot of formal experience to draw upon. But what I did have to draw upon was a large community of people that I'd met through online gaming. I almost didn't make it, but I did make it because of games. So this is why games are so near and dear to my heart, because they really let you kind of build community and practice things you wouldn't otherwise be able to necessarily in your real life. So, you know, jobs in people's lives are really multifaceted. You grow from learning new skills. So I think games are a really crucial place for us to kind of practice these things, including, you know, skills like mapping. So when I look back on my journey, I think about kind of some critical moments along the way and how I got to here. So I learned a lot kind of and brought into practice in my daily life how to teach and mentor people, how to be tactful, respectful, diplomatic, but still firm, how to delegate, how to not micromanage people, but how to give people the appropriate amount of autonomy. And when things do go wrong, how do I actually handle that? These are all kind of core things that relate to my job, but also are skills I learned through gaming. Let's talk about how I did that. So I first ventured into the massively multiplayer online gaming world in 2004 when I picked up a game called Puzzle Pirates. And I was an organizer of a group of folks who were out, you know, playing the game and pirating the Midnight Ocean together. And what I learned from that experience was how to really build on that set of skill of teaching people. I discovered, you know, Puzzle Pirates is not the most friendly game to learn initially. There are a lot of kind of skills you have to pick up along the way. And a lot of people kind of just, you know, would send you an invite off the docks and be like, hey, come join my fleet. And it's like, oh, okay. And then they just like yell at you, right? And that was not at all productive. So I eventually decided, you know what? I am going to, people who are being abusive in terms of just recruiting people and then not giving them any instructions, I'm going to apply the social puzzle. I'm going to PvP them until they stop doing that. And it was kind of this ridiculously cool emergent gameplay moment, right? Like where I was suddenly in this position of punishing people who are not, you know, not with game mechanics or with game mechanics, but not sanctioned by the game developers. I was punishing people who were engaging in behavior that was antisocial in the game. Super, super fun. The other fun thing was kind of organizing movements, figuring out how do I actually make all of these groups of people work together. So for instance, we decided we were going to PvP a particular group. And this year, what you're seeing on your screen, this is about 200, 300 people on each side fighting each other. Each one of those ships has about 20, 30 people working that ship. So you conquer an island with blockades. Blockades are kind of a game of capture the flag. You have to have ships, and ships have to have pirates, and you have to distribute pay to all of those people, right? So how do you actually get all of those ships sailing in the correct directions, not friendly firing each other, and how do you make sure that every single person on that ship is having fun, engaged? So I learned a lot about delegation and kind of organizing people and movements through Puzzle Pirates. The other thing was that Puzzle Pirates was my first tech job. I learned how to start debugging systems through that. So I started off kind of in the QA role, right? Like I was organizing user reports of trouble as a volunteer, even not even as a paid employee, and kind of documenting, here's what's going on, here are known workarounds, here's what you do. And that's how I got my first tech job. And that first tech job really, really saved my life because, as I said, I was disowned. I had no income. And that was really, really life-changing for me to realize that kind of those skills of collating information, organizing people, that I could kind of parlay that into something that would pay me money. So this is kind of an area where I think it's really exciting that Andie and I are on the same panel because EVE Online, again, massively changed my life. So thank you, Andie. So this is me. My ship is actually currently docked in LSC-4P, which is a system in the Syndicate region. And I've worn a number of hats over the past, 8 years playing EVE Online. But right now I handle kind of diplomacy, logistics. Those are kind of my key strength areas. So what EVE Online taught me, which I kind of, brought skills from my real life as a site reliability engineer into EVE Online and then vice versa, is what do you do when the shit hits the fan? So it turns out that if you're in a chaotic situation and no one is giving orders, it turns out that it's better for someone, anyone, to step up and say, do this, rather than just let things devolve. Because if you don't really kind of have someone coordinating, everyone's going to go their own way and you're going to wind up with your fleet wiped. It's not really great. So you kind of have to make sure that, people are willing and able to step up when they can, that you kind of have clear delegation of roles, and that also people keep mindful of communications bandwidth, right? Like, how much can one person process at a time? Are you spamming up the chat, or are you actually contributing something useful? I also learned a lot about how to keep things running for a longer period of time, because an engagement doesn't necessarily last for like half an hour in like a MOBA match, right? Our incidents in DevOps don't last half an hour, right? Like they can last hours, days, months. So how do you think about coordinating all this stuff? How do you distribute all the workload, right? How do you make sure that people will be awake at any given moment for the next week for 24 hours straight per day, right? How do you actually do that? How do you preserve operational security? How do you do retrospectives so you learn from these things? There's a lot of overlap between DevOps and what I learned in EVE Online. And also, like, you kind of have to, I like to say that in our workplaces, in general, you should be able to trust your coworkers, but you should not trust your systems. So why do we just kind of, trust our systems to do the right thing and not add any defenses in depth? You got to add defenses in depth, right? Otherwise, same way I could just, Control A, drag everything into my hangars, right? What if your systems walked away with all your queries? That wouldn't be so good, would it? But I think the kind of, you can learn those skills from kind of a number of different situations. But I think one of the really cool things for me was learning people management from games. So there's kind of this hierarchy of like spheres of people that you interact with, right? You have to, take care of yourself. And then there's kind of, maybe like 20 people, 50 people, 100 people that you interact with most closely. And then there's kind of, maybe a few thousand people that you interact with. And at one point in time, about 5 years ago, I was suddenly put in charge of 10,000 people, of 10,000 strangers. So I kind of had to really think about, like, what do you do? You got to listen. You got to think about, like, what do you do if there's that kind of rock star 10x engineer, right? And they're pissing everyone off. Turns out maybe coddling them is not the right thing to do. Maybe you kind of have to actually, gently give them feedback and eventually say, you know what, this organization is not right for you. So I seriously had to do this. I had to fire my former boss in EVE Online. I had to fire the person who used to run my alliance and put me in charge, and then I had to fire him, right? I'd never have to do that in a 10 or 20 year career, I hope. But I had to do that in EVE, and it kind of taught me a lot about how to be a manager. Situation, behavior, impact. Feedback really, really matters. And also, friends. Friendships matter. It's a very, very small world. So, kind of have to value your trustworthiness, right? Find mutual benefit. Find places where your interests intersect with someone else. Fun story. We were trying to evict someone's sandcastle and knock it over and steal all their stuff. And we wound up getting along culturally with them so well that we recruited them And now they're directors in our organization. It's amazing. It's hilarious. And those are the fun things that you can open yourself to if you just keep an open mind and people actually have that believe that you're going to be true to your word. But another thing that I learned is to really stick to your principles, right? Like, you know, if someone tells you to do something and you don't want to do it, you know, don't do it, right? Like, even if there's a cost to it. So I got involved in a very, very messy civil war in Eve about 7 years ago. And we said, we're not going to bend the knee. Like, you know, sorry, like, you know, that's your perspective. We're going to defend our principles to the very end. So a lot of these lessons carried over both into my site reliability engineering work, as well as into being a manager for real. So really briefly, Factorio, SREs, those two things kind of go together, peanut butter and jelly. So do less work yourself. Be really, really impatient, be lazy, and kind of prioritize where you spend your time. And if things go wrong, well, you know, you have to get a picture in your head of what does the system look like? And instead of memorizing every single little detail, how do I bisect? How do I figure out where this problem is coming from so that I can get to the bottom of it? And make sure that your system is self-adjusting. Don't just let it kind of bottleneck because you weren't paying attention. So let's talk a little bit about kind of the broader lessons I've learned over the past kind of 15 years of playing games. You know, you have to be really intentional about growth. You have to think about, like, what do you want to learn? How are you going to grow yourself? How are you going to get there? And yes, a map can help. So kind of, you know, what are you going to do next? What skills does your next project require? What skills do you want to learn? And how are you going to learn those skills? Even if you fail at it, it's a lesson in and of itself. And when you bring those skills to work, you can be more successful. So I think one interesting thing is that I didn't realize it at the time, but I was kind of performing mapping when I was kind of structuring these social systems, right? Engineering them for success, or at least for my organization's success, right? Making sure that all of the incentives were aligned correctly for people to feel like they were having meaningful impact, autonomy, and that they're having fun. And mapping also influenced my work. As I said in the intros, like about a year and a half ago, I learned formally about mapping. And that led me to kind of develop this mapping technique within the Honeycomb organization to think about how we message about observability, how we message about kind of this, about this maturity model of where's your organization along its observability journey. But gaming didn't all just help my day job. Gaming also really, really influenced the things that relate to workplace organizing. It helped me develop a sense of morality, right? Of standing up for what you think is right, even if it has a personal cost for you. And if something doesn't align with my internal compass, I'm going to follow my internal compass every single time. And I'll know exactly what I need to do to rally other people who also feel that same internal compass. So over the past couple of years, there have been a number of articles about what went wrong at Google, right? What happened in terms of neo-Nazis developing a beachhead inside of the company? What happened in terms of the company abandoning the principle of don't be evil? And other companies, workers at other companies have also followed that example of how to stand up against your employer, how to really fight for what you think is right. And one of the exciting projects I'm working on now outside of work is a solidarity fund that will help people with kind of cash payments to assist them in the event that they face retaliation from their workplaces if they're trying to organize for better working conditions or for more just workplaces. So that's kind of it for me. Go forth and learn and map. I hope it's as useful to you as it was to me.
Let me unmute myself. Wow, Liz. Where do we start with that? That was personal. At the same time, I could see, as somebody with a little bit of experience around mapping, I could really see how almost every process you described right from the beginning story. So my first question in my head was actually, how much did you learn from policing the gaming community and sort of excluding people with the wrong behavior and right behavior, and how did that sort of feed back? How much did your personal experience actually inform that is really the question.
I hadn't like personally been gang pressed in Puzzle Pirates, but I kind of, you know, picked up the pieces after that, when you'd have people wandering around being like, help, my crew is not giving me any like assistance learning the game, right? Funny thing, the same thing also does happen a little bit in EVE Online. People just get recruited and then told to send themselves to the middle of nowhere, and then they get bored, right? So kind of helping people recover from that situation is a thing that really influenced me to do something about it.
Yeah, and then the other piece is mapping outside the context of business. So we talk about evolutionary processes tend to focus on the ones that involve some sort of competition. When you step outside of that, so, you know, when I think of mapping my girlfriend's future career, we're sort of looking at what things may you want to do with a specific skill set that are away from the industry that you do now. So,
I certainly wish I'd been, you know, super intentional about it, but I kind of did it by accident.
right, well, it's the last point on the be super intentional about growth, and it's the, well, I rarely find people who have got great growth paths, great paths where they've grown a lot, who can look back and say, actually, I planned most of it. There's some level of serendipity. You know, if I look at where I sit in my world, I could probably see a few sort of individual points where I say, well, that was completely out of my control. But I suppose there's some value in recognizing.
Right, but it's what can you, even if things are completely out of your control, what can you do to kind of influence the outcome, right? Like, how can you minimize the effect of bad luck, right? How can you maximize the impact of good luck?
And sometimes even just being able to define which bit was luck and which bit was me. You know, there's a whole industry of people who invest our money out there, and there's lots of data out there to suggest that perhaps they're no better than a computer, an animal, or a small child. But, you know, in our own decision making, I see where the value of just even being able to recognize, you know, what was intentional, what was serendipitous, and then what was just completely unordered.
Yeah, retrospectives, right? Retrospectives are huge. One of the things that we do kind of both in the DevOps space and in EVE Online is like do retrospectives, right? Like, what did we learn from this? What went well, what went not well? Like, I'm not going to yell at you because you made a mistake, right? Like, I'd like to understand why was it so easy to make that mistake? Is there something we can do to systematically shore up the system for next time?
No, that's fantastic. Andie, Adrian, anything you can add to that? Any questions that you might have for Liz before we open the floor?
It sort of brought up some thoughts for me. When I was growing up, we didn't really, I'm a bit older, we didn't really have computers and the internet. And although I started playing like Lunar Lander when I was about 13 on some kind of mainframe thing at school, but not really gaming in this sense. But for me, the strategy game that I learned a lot from growing up was chess. I played chess in high school. I played it at county level at one of the local clubs, and I played it a bit at university as well. So I think it's these sort of strategy games. You learn from chess, you learn sort of the, you know, controlling space, as well as, you know, how positions map to space, how to plan ahead, and then there's sort of a pattern library for openings and things. So there's some sort of doctrine and some things there. So I think that for me, that was one of the sort of formative things as I grew up in gaming. And obviously I was playing other games and online games later, but in those formative years, I think it's good. And I saw my son growing up playing online role-playing strategy games. And
right, so many parents are like, "Oh my God, get off the computer! You're just
no,
fooling around." And it's like, no, you're learning.
Yeah, I mean, he got moved into product management, which is all about strategy, role-playing, and making alliances. He was doing sort of galactic conquest kind of stuff, but it wasn't EVE, but I forget which one. But I definitely see the value of gaming for developing your sense of strategy and tactics and all the different things there. So I think it's a really interesting view.
So what I want to know is, do you actually map to create strategy for your coalition? Are you mapping like the resource, like tactically in EVE Online? Like, are you mapping the resource landscape, the dependencies to move fleets or you know, resources, what you need, try to find the gaps?
Yeah, we definitely map through things like, you know, if we're about to deploy somewhere, what do we need, right? Like, what do we need in terms of income for our pilots? What do we need in terms of ships? How are we going to get those ships? What do we need in terms of diplomacy, right? Like, there's kind of this forest of, you know, in order for us to thrive here, what do we need? What do we need to succeed? It's not necessarily formally written out like in the map diagram sense, but like it's definitely a skill that all of us who are kind of in the leadership of this group are thinking about when we plan through, how, hey, here's what we're planning to do next.
Just to the point Adrian made around learning that you added to, Liz. I remember being told, well, yeah, get off the computer, go out and actually do things. In the weird situation we have now, whereas if you had a child and you had a choice between 3 hours on social media or 3 hours in a game, you probably put them in the nice contained, well thought out space where the things, the outside influences at least can be managed, at least it's curated in a way. Whereas in the social sphere, it's just, hey, I'm going to introduce my child to all the worst things that humanity has to offer, and they can talk directly to them. So it's just interesting the way the world has changed in that way, or the space has changed. We've got one question so far in the Q&A, and I can't imagine it's the only one. So we will come back. So what we might do is if we don't have questions yet, we'll just come back in this sort of shared Q&A. Question from Christopher Ayer. Have you discussed the MMORPG experience with Simon Woodley?
Yes, I have. It's actually how I came to be speaking here. Simon was like, yes, your experience with MMOs is like fascinating. Let's have you talk at Map Camp.
How long was the conversation and how detailed did it go into any specific game?
We talked a fair bit on Twitter. It actually wasn't synchronous, but we actually talked a lot about my experience with EVE Online.
Brilliant. Thanks, Liz. I don't think we've got any questions for now. So what we'll do is we'll go into this curious session that Adrian has planned for us, where I think we're going to see a map develop live. So great for any newbies watching, anybody who wants to get a better handle on this. You're watching a domain expert show us how he maps. Drum roll.
Actually, I was thinking the games I play now are mostly intercompany standards body political like CNCF board meetings and things like that. It's an interesting, I get to do it for real now, so the stakes are higher, I guess.
The players are more mature, Adrian.
Yeah, so I mean, yeah, so actually, towards the end, I'm going to talk about a new Linux Foundation body that I've got involved in that's in the sustainability area, but I'm going to start off by trying to share this map that I've been doing here. Okay, I'm screen sharing. Good. There. All right. Can people see this screen?
We can.
All
yes,
right.
but a weird focus.
A weird focus?
So
on the right-hand side, you should hopefully see a map.
No.
No, we just see a text file that says morality map.
Oh, what? Why isn't it sharing?
Are you on more than one screen?
I don't know what's going on here. Let's just stop the share and try sharing it again. That's, yeah, that's this. Okay. Let's share the whole desktop. And then when I open this. Right, can you see the browser now?
We can.
All right, good. So what I'm going to be talking about, I'm trying to figure out if you can use mapping to map rather than a value chain. I'm calling it kind of a morality chain. It's sort of thinking of morals as the things which are accepted, by society, if you like. And in particular, from a corporate point of view. So there's this thing called corporate responsibility or corporate social responsibility or environmental, social, and governance, which is what is the company's position on a thing that matters to you, whether it's Black Lives Matter or women's rights or whatever. So I'll sort of trying to sort of explore this space and look at the evolution of these things as they move from fringe. Sort of the ideas basically start out as one person has an idea and they're obviously a lunatic because there's only one of them. And then you get a few more people, it becomes sort of a fringe thing. Then it moves, then it becomes sort of a movement, a pressure. It's still a minority, but it's a movement that's got its own identity. And then it sort of turns from this custom built thing into something that's more like a product or an option. So you can choose a particular set of societal norms. You can decide that maybe you want to form unions. Not everyone likes unions, but some people do, some people don't. So they're sort of examples of things where there's a pre-built thing that you can buy into, but the world is divided. Not everyone agrees that these things are universally good. There's two sides or more than one option. And then finally, you get to this sort of commodity or utility model where you've got regulation that say everyone should run their companies the same way. There's financial regulations and things like that, and laws are sort of the thing that really builds down. It's okay, it's a law of the country, everyone has to do it whether you like it or not. This thing has been completely accepted at this point. So does that make sense? People, yeah. And then the people, sort of the anchors for this map, if you're a company, you're trying to acquire new customers. So I put that in the sort of Genesis side, right? These are new people that you want them to think good things about you and buy something from you, and not say, I don't want to buy from this company because the CEO said something stupid, right? And then there's shareholders who are looking at the corporate position of organizations, and then there's employees who see sort of the insider view of it, right? So that's sort of got, and then I spent forever building this thing, and I'm going to animate it by uncommenting things to sort of try to display it. So to start with, we've got the public position, like this is the position that's accepted, it's out in the market, what people say. And then there's a private position, which is what's said internally. And hopefully they're congruent. Occasionally they're not quite so congruent, right? One of the reasons is maybe there's stuff that's private that hasn't been released yet. Like there's a lot of stuff being developed and we haven't quite got to the point where we're announcing it to the world that we've done some good things or whatever. And sometimes there's just organizations where what they say publicly is not the same as what they're doing internally. And employees look at both of those and sometimes they go, you know what, I'm going to leave or I'm going to complain about this. So that we've, as Liz mentioned, some examples of that. So, all right, so hopefully that makes sense. So then there's what the executives say, like, the CEO says something either good or stupid and the world reacts and they think something different about the company. Marketing are producing content, there's web pages, there's pages about, this is your position on some social issue. And then there's a bunch of internal content, which is all the things internal to the company which support that private position, the marketing or the executive statements. What data do you have? What are you actually doing? All that kind of stuff. And quite often we're actually seeing board level mandates. Like there are rules now that boards have to have a female member, at least one. In fact, I think California's now made the rule to say there should be two. It's not just a token, it should be like we're looking for a more representative and diverse board. So there's a board level mandate in the best practices. So this is starting to come down from organizations that boards are looking at diversity, for example. Sometimes you're part of a supply chain, right? You either have a supply chain of companies who supply you with goods, or you are part of a supply where you supply some other company. Think about a manufacturing supply chain. And there are mandates that come down as part of that supply chain. Particularly sustainability is one where saying, I need to know the carbon footprint of this thing. Okay, I bought a power supply from somebody. What is the carbon footprint of that power supply? Those kinds of things. Another thing is, I'm calling it direct losses. Hopefully this makes sense. So sometimes it could be, hey, my building got flooded by climate change. It could be, people are boycotting your product because they don't like something about your company. Like Hobby Lobby is an example where, or they're, some people liked it, some people don't. So you get the sort of divisions in society where some people will align and some people will reject. You're also potentially building products that are based on this differentiation. like, you know, my product is not labeled green or sustainable in some way, or it particularly supports, like you see labeled women-owned businesses or minority-owned businesses on label of products, consumer products. So maybe you can differentiate your product based on your public position on some issue. And then I'm calling this rehabilitation, but the best example probably is Volkswagen. There's this whole thing about Dieselgate where they were cheating, there have been huge fines, people have been fired. The response of Volkswagen is that they have moved very heavily to electric vehicles. They basically said, we have to do something. We have to rehabilitate our reputation. And they bit the bullet and went very strongly into a new generation of something that they wouldn't probably have done before. Another example is energy companies like BP, who are now green energy suppliers and have very strong mandates to become. They're trying to move to a post-oil economy. You're seeing this in some of the states in Arabia, like Bahrain. They're investing in the post-oil economy. What are they going to do when the oil runs out? So there's sort of ideas here where you had a previous position that wasn't good, but you're trying to rehabilitate it. Just going to pause here. Does that make some kind of sense? I'm not sure if I got all the labels right here. Any comments on that at this point? People don't want to actually comment, but okay, let's I'll move on a bit.
I was on mute there, Adrian.
Oh, sorry.
What I will say, to anybody who's watching and wants to comment or ask any questions, I know that Adrian likes an interactive sort of conversation, and this is the question and answer, so feel free to interject with questions. I'll find a suitable moment to jump in and ask them.
Yeah, so what I've tried to do here is map the various components that would make up a corporate position on something. So then the next question is, so what does this look like for a particular issue? And I think one that gives a real sort of clear view of this, I think, is women's rights. And if you look at 100 years ago, women's rights were emergent. And there was a tweet I saw today that on this day in 1907, which is only just over 100 years ago, was the sort of birth of the suffragette movement in the UK, where women said, hey, we want the right to vote. And they did it at a meeting where I think Winston Churchill was doing some rally, and he said, hey, we want the right to vote. And they got put in prison for disrupting this meeting. So, obviously nowadays we've moved on a little bit, and we can show the evolution of this to it's the law of the land that you should be equal in many different ways. And it's socially unacceptable for a company to have the position that they can discriminate against women, right? 100 years ago, it was normal. It wouldn't be disadvantaged, and now it's become mainstream, right? So does that make sense? Yeah. So if we think about, I'm going to hide those again. This is the first time I've used this tool, and I'm sort of still figuring out whether this is a good way of doing it. If we look at another one, let's say the minimum wage. This is something where obviously the employees themselves care about it, because maybe some of them are getting that minimum wage. There's unions, there's societal norms, there's regulations and laws about it. And it's kind of evolving to the right. It's becoming more prevalent. It's becoming something that more CEOs are standing up and saying, yeah, there should be a minimum wage. It should be at a higher level, that kind of thing. But it's still in this emerging stage. There isn't universal agreement that this is a good thing, but it's moving from the left to the right in this competing options, meaning that it's moving from a minority position to a more majority position, I think. And then to put it on the same area, we've got this idea of universal basic income, which is something that I think is still kind of a fringe view. There's maybe a movement around it. There's a few people saying this would be a good idea. And there's a few countries in the world and a few places where it's being tried. But I'd say that it's still off on the left. So one of the interesting things to look at in terms of mapping is, can you track universal basic income moving to the right? Can you find more people supporting it? Is it something that's going to become mainstream over time? And how does it affect these discussions about minimum wage and what is a living wage and all this kind of stuff? So does that seem like a reasonable way of looking at this? Okay.
It does. There's an ongoing stream in the chat, by the way, which is just basically saying that people are really enjoying the method. A few people saying they will be stealing this methodology of slowly uncommenting as a way of sort of showing it working.
I'm going to share this this document because there's a way to do a clonable share thing. I'll put that in the chat later.
Yeah, there was one question which was around the x-axis, and I think it was just to do with the Zoom window. So asking was the x-axis basically lunatics to laws, and I think what's now visible is the new crazy ideas to
yeah. So what I put along the bottom was, you know, new ideas, not necessarily crazy, but people generally think of them. If only one person has an idea, then it generally gets people think it's a crazy idea. And then building consensus, competing options, and broadly accepted. And I was trying, it sort of aligns with the general evolution axis in some way. Okay, here's one that's a bit more current, is sort of racial equality and how that is evolving.
Well, as you do that, there's one question from Andy Bennett, which is just about Overton window. So is it possible to visualize the Overton window on this kind of map? I just want you to answer that in case.
Yeah, I was thinking this actually does talk. It is, the Overton window is when something moves from being a lunatic idea that's not safe for discussion in polite company or whatever you call it, to something that becomes accepted. And we're seeing this on both sides. In fact, we see it on the right wing will do sort of regressive or conservative, but they'll reintroduce ideas that that are, you know, will try and push to the left, push an idea to the left, make the idea of racial discrimination more currently popular, or more something that can be discussed rather than something that's off the table. So the Overton window is like, what is on the table? So we're always adding things to put it on the table is a progressive thing, and they're trying to push back is more of a conservative thing. So there's some kind of sense that this is sort of progressives push to the right and conservatives try to block it or push back to the left. And the Overton window is the, what is, what you can talk about on TV without getting fired, kind of, whatever you want to call that thing. I think the one that I wanted to put up here next was sort of the Black Lives Matter, which was something that was, you know, it emerged recently. And what I thought was remarkable was the number of, I was getting emails from all kinds of companies this year about their COVID response and what they thought about Black Lives Matter. All these companies, we didn't even know they had our emails, right? All these companies that you ever dealt with felt compelled to send you a message saying, this is what we think about Black Lives Matter. And executive statements, Andie has been public about this, and many other large corporates. And there's actually stuff going on inside Amazon to, there's real change happening this year as a result of this. There's a new focus on adding diversity. There are new goals around this, and a lot more sort of, I mean, it's been like, yes, we support racial equality, but there's been additional focus on it. So I think what's happened this year is that the ideas around racial equality, the morality of it has moved more mainstream, and organizations that don't have a public position on this are going to start getting, losing customers and suffering from being excluded from the, like, getting out of that Overton window, if you like. And that makes sense?
Yeah.
Okay. So I was just trying to pick a few things that I thought were reasonably, that would resonate with people. The one that I really started off with, but I want to end with, is sustainability, because this is something I'm personally involved with at the moment. If you think about building sustainable products, there's quite a bit of product differentiation you can do. So this product was made in a sustainable way. We're seeing that's quite a bit of branding around that. There's people that have not had sustainable products in the past, like oil companies that are trying to rehabilitate and then, you know, you get accused of greenwashing, but they are trying to be better in many cases. So there's some issues around that. There's definitely direct losses from sustainability. Climate change impact is affecting companies directly, as well as you know, affecting their sort of reputation, their products. This is an area where the supply chain mandate's pretty strong, and we're starting to get some board level mandates. And in fact, it's just starting to evolve a little bit more. And let's just say, I'm going to add this next. So one of the things that's happening is this idea of a financial risk assessment. So what is if you take an organization, like a company, a publicly listed company, what is the financial risk to that company based on different climate change scenarios? Like, are they going to lose business? Are they going to gain business? You know, what is affecting their value? And this is starting to become something that is part of the quarterly reporting of financial results. And you're starting to see these carbon footprint reports and things like that coming out from companies, like large companies. So so this is currently more on a voluntary basis, but New Zealand just made this mandatory. So one of the things is this is likely to start spreading around the world to become a mandatory thing. There's a thing called the Science-Based Targets Initiative. And this is a sort of a standardized way of doing that reporting. And most recently, there's the Linux Foundation has created something called the Climate Finance Foundation, which sounds a bit weird. Why would climate and finance matter? What this is, it's the people who do portfolio valuations trying to understand the climate risk to those portfolios, right? And this is insurance companies, like how do you insure and how do you do corporate level insurance when some of the buildings are going to be underwater in 10 years, those kinds of things. That's physical risk, but there's also business risk. There's lots of other types of risk or economic risk, all those kinds of things, if the economy restructures because of climate change. Anyway, so the idea of the LFCF is that by standardizing and making it easier for companies to report their financial climate risk, it will actually cause a business justification for companies to spend more on doing something about it, right? So the sort of hope here is that we pull sustainability from something that's, you know, kind of a minority position that a few companies are worried about, to something that's most companies report, and in the case of New Zealand, it's now a law, so it would pull across that line and to be just mandatory. And I think, so that's what I've got as the discussion, but this is I'm currently AWS's sort of representative, or one of the people leading our work on LFCF, and it just was announced a month or so ago. We're sort of gradually putting together basically a data lake that has all of the relevant data in it and that other people can work with. Other people involved in this are Microsoft, Allianz, S&P Global, and a few other smaller companies that do climate risk modeling and things like that. So anyway, that was what I had. Happy to throw that open to questions. I'll go look at the discussion panel.
Yeah, can I bring your attention to one of them at the beginning, Rob Tully. From a mapping beginner, why are the top concepts so far over to the left? Why would you class a public corporate position as fringes or executive statements close to lunatic? Did those bits evolve too? There are a few answers.
It was more that they're new, they're creative, they're novel, right? So like say about a year ago, Jeff Bezos got up and said publicly, we're going to have this climate pledge. We're going to meet the Paris Agreement 10 years early, and we're going to move Amazon from being middle of the pack to a leading position, right? So that is a corporate statement, which was a novel thing for the company. So I put it right out of there. It was a new thing, and it basically dragged the company over and pulled it across. So that's the sort of.
What's interesting is what predecessors were to it, right? Like the article that I showed, like on my second to last slide, right? Like that was Amazon employees pledging to go on climate strike, right? And I think that that's super interesting that Amazon like put out the climate pledge only like after the employees like had agitated for a while, right? Like, so it was this thing where you needed both kind of some amount of leadership will to do it, or at least to be goaded into doing it, or they wanted like the cover with their investors to do it. And then that combination led the company to be dragged in that direction, right? So it's not just the executives who on their own one day.
I think the planning for this was way predated the employee activism. Maybe the timing of when it was announced was driven by that to some extent, but Kara Hurst was hired as VP of Sustainability 6 years ago. So there's a long history of things developing. And then the question is, how do you position that? So yeah, so there's this internal, external marketing positioning and executive leadership on these issues. And some of it is driven internally and some of it is driven by sort of trying to manage a public situation. So you see that across the space. But yeah, there's it's definitely it's an interesting area. So I'm going to have a look at what have we got here.
To Liz's question though, how would you? That's the best way to ask this. How would you quantify the impact of the internal employee action on the overall decision? So did it accelerate it? Did it increase the overall magnitude of the impact, or have no effect at all?
No, I don't think it had as much impact as they thought. I think it was already in plan. It may have affected the timing of when it was done, but it was done around another public event. I forget exactly what it was, but this is also because when you're looking from the outside, you see the public position changing, you don't see that internal position. So the internal position is usually ahead of the public position, right? So there's a lot more going on, for example, in sustainability than is being talked about right now in a lot of companies. And as things mature and get sorted out, they get, okay, now we're ready to talk about it, and it gets put up there publicly. And if you're agitating from the outside for something to happen, then it can look like, well, it happened in response to you, but you know, you're certainly helping justify it, but you're not necessarily causing it. I think that's probably how I put that, from sort of seeing it from inside and outside.
So we've got questions ranging from the Overton window, just the general relevance of that, and a few sort of specific mapping related questions. Also, I did say that, oh no, that's more towards the end after we've had Andie.
Yeah, there's a point here that Black Lives Matter is moving to the right much faster. Yeah, I mean, that is a social movement that came up much more recently and was really captured the sort of the public discussion, right? So I'd say sustainability has been a long-running thing, and there's been an entrenched battle over it for the last decade or two, with a lot of misinformation and oil companies and people like vested interests trying to block it. And I think that some of the more recent things that spread more virally in the public consciousness, like they're just going to come up, right? And there will be more things that come up. And then so the question then is, if you're an organization trying to figure out how to map these things, maybe you could map the things which may be emerging and say, what would we do if this issue became a hot topic, or this issue became a hot topic? Have we figured out what our strategic response to that would be, and do it sort of as a forward-looking scenario planning exercise, right? And then, because one of the things that is for predicting the future, there's this sort of Heisenberg effect, which you can predict what will happen, or you can predict when it will happen, but you can't predict both. Right, so there's a bunch of things that I've been waiting for. It's like, this is going to happen one day, but I can't say when. It's maybe this year, maybe next year, maybe years out. Right?
Because then you have the issue as well. Where does the activities of the Black Lives Matter movement stop, and the activities of the civil rights movement that goes much further back, and where do they overlap? To me, the interesting thing is just the Was it specific incidents? Was it the domain? So if we look at the political scenario that we find who the US president is, certain messaging around that, how much did that influence the success of the Black Lives Matter movement? You get into it, and really you've got to map it at this point. The only way to really understand it is to map it all.
Yeah, I think there's definitely a lot of current environment will drive that. But the point, I think, is that the overall racial equality, which was already, reasonably well institutionalized, but was maybe there was some lip service to it in some cases. That what I'm seeing is organizations beefing up their internal racial equality goals, metrics, and hiring policies, promotion policies, just saying, okay, we need to be much stronger in this area. And I think that is part of the sort of corporate response to the social situation. So I think that's actually, hopefully people got that's what I was talking about there.
Yeah, that's good.
I definitely think that one of the challenges around that is to what extent are corporations, wanting to appear to do the right thing versus do the right thing, right? Like where they may be trying to appease, a peaceable core mad at the company without necessarily making structural changes.
Yeah, that's sort of the greenwashing or whatever the equivalent of that would be for other issues. But yeah, there can be certainly cases where like the PR team basically, okay, let's just stop the bleeding here and get a statement out, and then we'll deal with what that means internally later. I think it depends what kind of company it is and how it's driven, but from what I've seen, I've most recently worked at Netflix and Amazon, and there's a lot of very deep corporate responsibility in both those organizations. Something from Netflix I saw recently, they decided to place some of their banking with minority-owned banks, so black-owned banks. I think they had like 100 million of the money that they just have stashed away somewhere. They said, we're just going to hold it. We're just going to open bank accounts at banks where we want to support that business. So I thought that was an interesting idea. But those kinds of things sort of start off as sort of individual ideas, and then eventually, maybe one day that moves to become more of a common thing that people do.
I think it's interesting that you had employees in this map as well, because I think it's becoming a point of survival for knowledge work intensive businesses to, have people want to work there. And this is, one of these situations where, culture is another one of these topics that companies now invest heavily in, because everybody's realized, since many years now, that you can no longer micromanage anybody's work. You have to sort of trust that they are somehow committed to what the company is working on. And if that mission of the company is not palatable to a large amount of highly competent people, you're probably not going to be successful as a business. So I think that this is very interesting to see this mapped. And I think that many companies have implicitly done this type of mapping and recognize it as also a pure kind of talent pipeline survival question. Because you say employees care about this, not just existing employees, but potential future employees. And people are now, like you're saying, starting to leave companies that do not.
Yeah, it's a percentage play, right? It's what percentage of employees are willing to walk out the door. And as we saw with Coinbase, it's at least 5%, right? And I think that that's pretty telling, that 5% of employees would walk away from their jobs in the middle of a pandemic.
Yeah, and it's not just that people sort of leave companies that are atrocious or like work on actively sort of bad stuff. It's that people are just choosing not to take employment in the first place if these things not just only meet like a baseline. It's not enough to be like not evil. There is now the demand is moving, like the consensus, the morality kind of consensus is moving further right to say that this is like active effort is now a new baseline for many businesses and types of companies.
It becomes really interesting. You just mentioned COVID, Liz, and the pandemic, and the widening of the practical field, which companies are willing to go to for talent, the dropping of the barriers around what you need to show and where you need to be in order to be hired. So it now means that you're hiring across a far more diverse field of opinions. You know, want to pick up somebody in one country, it's going to be an entirely. So you've got to track a lot more. It's not just tracking what's going on in one domain, but also in where you might want to hire people and understanding how messages carry across jurisdictions.
Yeah, I think certainly we could do, like, one of the examples I could draw on this map is working from home, right? And what is the corporate position on working from home? Some companies fully distributed, others were like, you really have to be there. And I think we've seen an evolution of that idea to become much more mainstream in the last, during this year.
We have so many questions, so little time. So I'd love to hear from Andie and see Andie's talk as well. And what we'll do is with the Q&A time, we'll open it out so we can ask questions on any of the 3 talks you've seen so far.
Yep.
And thanks everyone for your questions. They're really good.
All right, let's get something up on the screen here. Let's see if I can follow. Let's see if I can follow this these 2 talks. So I'm Andie Nordgren, and I have a background in a lot of contexts where you could say it's sort of user-driven services, or where user initiative and participation matters a whole lot for the thing to be successful. One of these things is EVE Online, the game that I'm happy to hear it changed Liz's life, that I worked on for about 8 years. So started on the tech side there, and then went over to run product development, and then eventually as executive producer. Right now I'm at Unity Technologies, more back on the tech and engineering side again, rather than the product side. But there's a lot of in common actually with designing for user-driven game environments and thinking about technology organizations. And a lot of the things around mapping, which is thinking about how teams actually interact. And you also have the teachings from the Team Topologies book, which is all about team interactions. And for me, this all ties together kind of very nicely, and there's some strong explanatory power in both mapping and the evolution concept, but also in these kind of teachings from various corners related to the mapping community. But what I want to talk about today is really what has, coming from this type of background where designing for multiple people at the same time, interacting with each other is kind of built in. I've been surprised and sort of baffled when coming to other contexts about how not present this concept is when people do design or think about systems. And I encountered sort of the same when I came to Wordly Maps, because here we have the user need as an anchor, which is amazing. And as we saw just in Adrian's map now, we can visualize with a map some of the interdependencies and relationships that really matter for something in the value chain. But what I've always looked to do is to zoom in on those actual relationships and think about how do we actually design actively, not sort of accidentally, for people with each other rather than people with our system. And so this is what I want to talk about today, is to share my little framework for how I actually do this, in the hope that this will be useful for you as well. So what I'm talking about here really is that what we very commonly see is a focus, even if we have a user focus. You have doctrine from Simon, right? Think about user needs. Great. We have to do that. But very often thinking about user needs is framed as thinking about a solo user with our system. And this particular framing gives you certain, ideas, questions, starting points. And what we've done when working on a super user-driven game like EVE Online, for example, is that all the player behavior is super interconnected. The game actually defines only kind of the platform for people to act on. And then the actual user experience is emergent amongst the players. What they do with each other is a key to both the experience, the value anyone is getting out of it, and really to the whole thing existing in the first place. And so to me, what I have done for a long time now is to shift my design focus and my thinking about systems, about organizations, about mapping as well, is to shift that focus and say, what if we think from the beginning about users with each other? And sometimes this can be users with each other inside your service, but sometimes, you know, your user is using your service, but maybe they're doing it for a purpose other than using your service. Maybe they're doing it in a context which has nothing to do with you, but you might still want to think about that user's relationship with the rest of the world. If they're making something in a tool that you're creating, they're probably doing it for some purpose that has to do not with their usage of your system, but with their existence and their broader context. And this method is really quite simple. And I have started talking about it as looking at the participation dynamics in situations where this matters. Of course, you have a lot of UX design, which is really about nailing the individual interaction. At some point, a user has to sit down and press a button to achieve some particular outcome in your system. And so that type of design is really important. But I find that something new really happens when you start in some of the looking at the relationships between users rather than the relationship between the user and your system. So I want to share what I call the participation dynamics canvas of sorts, which is really my own tool for how I assess the participation dynamics in a situation. And as you can see some of the components here on the screen, I also do this with mapping, right? So I'm not going to draw a map here, but I want to explain how I basically take a situation that has participation dynamics of some sort. It might be teams in your organization that need to collaborate to create something of value for your customers. It might be players in your game that are going to play together. It might be one user of your service who you wish would invite another user, for example. And this technique is really about putting these on some sort of space where you can think, a whiteboard or whatever. This is not a model that requires 3 roles or anything like that. I'm just putting 3 on here because if you have more, it usually gets too complicated. Often probably you just want to look at 2, but this is a kind of example, right? And so we look at the participation role that someone might take. Maybe this is, you know, one team that wants to achieve something in the company, or like I said, it's a kind of good example with you kind of wish that users would invite other users to your service. It's a pretty common case. That's would be a great sign, right? Net promoter score and all of that. If one user would, you know, organically tell another to also use your service. And what I really ask myself then is like, okay, if we want this relationship to happen, we want, you know, user 1 or participant 1 to actually invite somebody else. What questions is this user sitting with before they would act like that? And when you start asking this question, you can tell here it has nothing to do with our system per se, right? It has nothing to do with the interactions that happen in our system. That comes later. It has to do with like, okay, if I send, say I'm going to send a link here, for example, I send it to someone. If they don't understand what they've been sent, they're going to have a bad experience. So if I can't see what it's going to look like when they are receiving it, I might not send it in the first place. Or if I can't control the experience for the person who's going to receive or join the service, or I can't explain or facilitate, or I don't have that control, basically, I might not send it in the first place. And for the person who receives the invite, they got it from someone. Who sent it? Do I even know this person? Who was it? Does it come with trust to begin with? What is it that I've been sent? What am I being asked to do? Can I reach it? Am I on my mobile phone or am I on my, PC? Does that cause friction? does the sender have to actually know where I'm going to receive this? If I'm sending an invite to like a PC type tool, if you send me an invite to EVE Online and I receive it on my mobile phone, can I actually do anything? And if I can't, maybe I feel stupid. And now I had a bad experience with the person who sent it, and they lose social credit actually for inviting me. They don't gain it. And you can hear this as an example, right? But these are the types of questions you start asking with this perspective. And step number 2 here becomes to look at, okay, if we want users to act in some way, now we can start to map also for each user, but in the context that they're going to interact, right? So we can look at what is the kind of value chain of components that this user depends on to act.
You can come sit with me.
What is it that they need to act? And what does that value chain look like? And could we actually, how much does it impact the willingness to act, if you will? If we take another example with teams that we wish would collaborate in an organization, if each collaboration depends heavily on, for example, you know, a lot of meetings and sort of custom discussions every time, then it's quite an expensive thing to do, and it's custom every time, so it's quite costly. And if we want more of this type of collaboration to happen, we probably need to look at something in that underlying value chain. And this is where you have an interesting, you know, I mean, now what is it, like 10 or 15 years ago that Amazon, for example, made this kind of API transition, forcing almost every team to make what they build a product that can be consumed internally by other teams. And that's one of these kind of collaboration factors that I'm sure it has its complexities too. But it's something that you might have discovered if you thought like this, right? And in the case where you're sending an invite link to someone or whatever, you might say that actually we wish for this to happen, but if we map the kind of value chain for each user to act, we can see that they can't really. There might be missing pieces in between to facilitate the relationship. And if our job as system designers change to actually facilitating this relationship and equipping each participant with more interesting agency or capability, then we might also lean on other systems or recognize that other people's systems are part of the kind of step chain to have the relationship actually work here. So in the sharing example, you know, users would actually, how are they going to send it? They're going to send it in some messenger app, right? Or they're going to send an email, or how is it actually going to happen? And this type of mapping, you can of course like get to it in a roundabout way if you have a focus on a solo user. But I have found that this perspective, just putting the kind of roles that people either take already or we wish for them to take on the whiteboard like this, and then adding in a little bit of value chain mapping to understand like what is the environment that shapes the ability for each actor to act in relationship to the others. It just creates a completely different design discussion, whether it's the organization or your product that you're trying to design. And then again, the mapping kind of comes in here to understand the landscape for each user. And what I found interesting with this, just like mapping lets you, like the normal wordly mapping lets you talk about hypothetical scenarios and saying, what if, you know, what if this component evolves, or we know it will, but, you know, what if it evolves really quickly soon? Or what if this kind of inertia is blocking our competitors? What would happen if we did something here? How can we act in the system? Mapping the relationships like this and looking at the underlying value chains means that we can also talk about hypothetical relationships and hypothetical interactions that we wish would happen, and actively talk about how can we change the dynamics in the underlying value chains such that these relationships or interactions actually become viable. So you can talk about this part in the middle here, which is basically, you know, what matters for the relationship or interaction. Is it trust? Is it cost? Is it speed, power differences, social credit, identity? Like, what is involved? And you can talk about viability. Like, is this going to happen? And you might also identify interactions or relationships that happen today, but that depend on like completely novel or custom built solutions. So someone's finding value in it, right? Someone is making it happen, but there's like high amount of friction. And this here, you can find a business opportunity, for example, because you're saying, we're going to make this type of interaction really sing. And I think this is also what happens when new practices evolve, as components evolve, like Simon talks about on the map, right? This is kind of what happens, right? In these interactions between people or entities like teams, like any agent really that acts with some independence, as the value chains sort of below that shape these people's agency change, new things become viable for them to do. And so these practices evolve as well. They co-evolve with the evolution of components. And so this is that little framework, and I encourage you to try it. What happens? Take some user relationships, start with users with each other rather than users with your system, and see what happens. Start thinking about, you know, what questions are people sitting with, what makes the interaction viable. And we have then also, you know, learned, and like I say, sometimes you can just start with two, you know, like two roles interacting. Sometimes you have more, you know, complex dynamics where but, you know, starting with just two is probably plenty. I talked about hypothetical interaction, and then I also want to kind of end with one of the big learnings that we have from designing in this space and starting to think about these participation dynamics, is that there is a huge factor that tends to shape anything that has to do with human relations, which is that fear of rejection leads to passive behavior. This has been my kind of huge lesson. If I don't know what a situation is like, if it's unclear to me what my actions look like, if I kind of don't know what's going on here, I'm probably going to stay passive. So a team in an organization, for example, that's not really sure what happens if you try to collaborate with other teams. They haven't really seen it. It seems complicated. Oh, who's the boss of who, or whatever, right? They're likely going to stay passive. So if you want some change in that, there's a couple of tactics that we learn work, which is a lot about designing for lurking, like help people see what goes on, model participation. Sometimes you want to model mistakes as well. Make it easy to see and triangulate what goes on here so that people can take the step from lurker to participant to someone who's actively acting in the context or system that you're dealing with. And I think that if we have a final loop back to the question of morality, I would say that this type of framework actually informs my own moral principles, because I use this type of thinking to think about agency for the individual, looking at, in a given situation, what is actually impacting the ability for the individual to act with some autonomy and to have freedom, basically. And if they don't, we should probably do something about it. And that there are many things that can impact that, but actually some of them can be actually quite precisely analyzed. And this type of framework, if you look at social norms, for example, the question, say, you know, I'm a woman in technology and I might sit in a certain situation and say, should I speak up here? I have these questions I'm sitting with. Should I speak up on Twitter? Oh, what might happen to me? You know, there might be a mob that is basically, you know, going to swat me. And so maybe that's not such a good idea. And so these questions tend to be all connected for me. And also if you bring it into your organization, is really thinking about who has power, who has agency, who has the ability to act, And this type of framework can really help you think about that as well, or it has at least helped me do that. So that's my participation dynamics canvas. I hope it's useful to someone, and please ask me questions.
But the first and only obvious question is, can we have a whip round so that Andie can go and work for 6 months at Facebook? Because they need to see all of this, and it could potentially fix the entire world. Well,
but, I probably don't want to work there. It's too late for them, right?
That's our remuneration to you for accepting the job. I'm sure they'd pay you as well. Really good, Andie. Wow. Adrian, Liz, any thoughts to append questions to ask?
I see a lot of kind of how the design of EVE Online evolved. Now that I look at it through your lens, Andie, this is super helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, I think it's really useful to be mapping the way you operate internally and the way you think about interacting with other parts of the organization, as well as into products. And then when your product is actually about human interaction, it all kind of blends into a really interesting mix. So I hadn't really thought previously about, because there's usually a product as a separate thing, and then what you're doing is something different. But when what you're building is a product that is just about interactions, that's yeah.
One comment I like from Harry Voss: designing for lurking. Love it. Thanks, Andie.
The other thing that I would think was super interesting was kind of this idea that there are other systems beyond your own system that you have to think about that there are interactions with, right? Like people interact with each other, and your systems interact with other people's systems to create this kind of feedback loop.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I'm just looking in the chat. Sorry, I was just listening and lost all them. A map is working if there is a conflict. That's from Christian Blundell. It's funny because that actually came up from the first talk I did this morning, and that was one of the questions: how do you tell if a map is working? And I jumped in and said, well, either people are fighting about what should be in the map, or they're fighting about the outcome of the map.
Yeah, if something's obvious and universally and everyone's figured out what to do, then the map confirms that everyone's using the same terminology and agrees. Then it's a very quick mapping exercise, right? You just move on and do it. But it's definitely useful where people are trying to just make decisions, right? Or understand or get everybody on the same page and the same map, basically. I think that's the most powerful use for this.
Yeah, and also sometimes, and I find this in my work where I'm using a map to understand other organizations, particularly the solutions they're trying to build internally. And it's exposing where, for example, you've got a stakeholder who isn't playing well and necessarily isn't being transparent with everybody else. It then becomes very clear on the map because the asks are quite common, which is just to say, where does a component go? How do you understand it? And so if you get friction basically in the inability of getting useful information, that will often expose its own story. Why isn't somebody contributing to the map? Is it something that's likely to expose, issues or skin in the game for them? Andie, if you were to take the participation dynamics canvas and go into an organization of any type where you thought it would be useful, where would you go and why? So just taking my Facebook question, which was a flippant joke, but actually making it serious, where would you take this to have the most impact?
Probably to whatever UX design team or design org there is, because they are if we are talking about product impact, because they are already sitting with the user problems. They have a passion for being user-centric, and this is just really a sort of slight widening of the perspective, and you can apply many of the same methods in terms of doing discovery of what are these things. I mean, a lot you can actually reason through. I believe that you can, especially when you're trying to innovate, you actually need to reason through these relationship and participation dynamics on your own, because you can't ask users about something that's not happening yet. Like, because you have to deal with like multiple moving parts at the same time. And this also makes it a more complex like design problem, because you can't just go out like, let's find the user type, let's interview them about what they want, and then let's go and build that. Okay, you know, great, it works for certain use cases, but usually for things that are more kind of areas that are more evolved. And if we're talking about Genesis type of product development, where we're really trying to create new behaviors, then usually there is some unlock, some innovation in how people are able to interact with each other. And you see some of this, like, you know, the thing that has made it to every social product now, which is like the story, which is really perishable, you know, a perishable post. It changed these kind of participation dynamics, right? It lowered the barrier for publishing, because you could put stuff out there that wasn't going to stay up forever. And that was like an actual kind of true innovation in participation dynamics. And that's why it's been like, you know, kind of now everywhere, right? Because it found a new way for people to interact and participate. But yeah, so, but if it comes to org design, for example, then you want to, you know, bring this together. Obviously has a lot to do with, I mean, Team Topology's book and framework has looked at a couple of specific, what I would call, you know, interaction dynamics or patterns for teams that they've found work really well in technology organizations. But I think that as you get to the ground, you always have situation specific stuff enough that I think it's useful to use this type of canvas or framework to go and think specifically, like, in our organization, what does it mean to provide X as a platform? Like, literally, like, where is the team API? Like, where is the information that others will use to do kind of discovery of how they can collaborate with other teams, or what's available as a platform internally? Like, all of these questions get to a very, even if you buy the concept of the different interaction models from Team Topologies, then when it comes to implementation, you like, if you think of the individual team as a user of the organization, you're probably only going to reach so far in how you can map and understand what is going to create these successful participation dynamics.
I've got a question here. How do you do hypothesis testing? Do you do A/B testing of these ideas? I mean, you map something out, you have a hypothesis that this is going to work or this isn't going to work, and how do you implement that to find out what actually works and what was a good guess or a bad guess?
It's really hard. Like, we found this with EVE Online, and I've found this in many other contexts. As soon as you have, you know, a system where you have many users interacting and with many different kind of intents and so on, it becomes more or less impossible to A/B test anything, because it works really well for these kind of, is the button blue or green, or what's the value prop described on our website and whatever. And as soon as you have these much more in the complex domain dynamics with multiple people acting based on slightly different, you can never recreate kind of reality. On EVE Online, we were only able to user test on, or sorry, A/B test on like the first 1 hour in the game, when everyone is like going through mostly the same, or we can sort of justifiably shove people through the same educational experience that we think is going to be good for them. But still you have the case of people joining through corporations, coming straight from like Reddit, where they got an invite code, a referral code, they're joining straight into a corporation. The corporation is actually doing the onboarding, and there's no way, maybe there is one, but you know, with like some new industrial grade AI or whatever, but like, so I have found that this is an area where you have to just make bets. Like, you have to have some you can reason through the dynamics, you make some bet, and you see if it actually happens. And sometimes you're kind of you have to teach users, you have this kind of jobs to be done that don't really exist yet that you have to make bets.
It's kind of this interesting thing, right? Like where you have to approach everything as an experiment, right? Like how am I going to measure the outcome, right? What do I expect to see,
Yeah.
right? And that I think is deeply coupled with this idea of observability, of chaos engineering, right? Like how do you actually measure these things where you don't control the entire outcome?
I think that starting point is to define that interaction or that relationship or participation dynamic that you would like to see. And then you start making some intervention in the system and start to see, okay, is this happening more? Like we hypothesized that if we made it less costly for teams to collaborate, we would see like more team collaborations. And maybe we have some way to measure that. Maybe we don't. Maybe we have to do a qualitative like assessment. But that's the only way that I have found that you can kind of meaningfully approach it.
Yeah, going back to sort of my experiences at Netflix, the main thing we were optimizing for was retention, right? You know, did the customers turn from a free trial into a paying customer, and how long do they stick around? That takes months to discover.
Yeah.
So the proxy for that was always engagement. Like, so it turns out the more movies you watch, the more likely you are to stay as a customer. If you're not using the product, then you're not likely to stick around. So do you and then the way Netflix works, I guess, you can give people different experiences. Like everyone that works, every user at Netflix is a different set of guinea pigs, right? Everyone's in a different set of tests. It's all hypothesis testing. It's sort of the extreme, the other way, really. So everything they do is incrementally tested into existence. And one of the interesting things is to make it really low cost to try an idea, which means you start trying the wild, crazy ideas that only 1 or 2 people think are good. And some of those turn out to be big wins. And if it's more expensive to try out an idea, then it's much harder to find those things hiding on the long tail that nobody knows are there. Right?
And so in a Netflix case, like, I mean, slight tangent, right? But I would be interested in there. What I would put on this kind of canvas would be the members in a household, and then adjacent households maybe, or friends and kind of family, right? Because you have these facilitation relationships where the people my age, you know, the kids in their 40s are helping, you know, their parents get set up, right? What would make that actually happen? Okay, is actually the person that I'm going to see something, I'm going to see enough content in there that I start to think it's a great idea for my dad who watches a bunch of TV from normal channels to get set up with an account, right? And I have kids and I'm looking at what's the content for them. Am I gonna like these kind of dynamics? And it's not necessarily that each and every one of them will be crucial or will like matter like a lot, but just starting to explore them and reason around what goes on here, what questions are people sitting with, and what landscape is shaping people's like willingness or ability to act. This starts to surface new questions and new ideas, in my experience.
That's so interesting, and I know we're over time, but this I thought someone recommended something to me the other day, and my first thought wasn't, oh, will it be good? Do some research. It was to evaluate that person in my relationship, what it was that they thought I might like out of it. And then once I decided that, yeah, they know me well enough, it was just go ahead and watch it. So my whole process of evaluating the program now got circumvented, and I was getting into a different sort of checksum in order to decide whether or not it was something I wanted to watch. And it wasn't until this conversation really I realized what had happened there. Thank you so much. We have one more question. Oh no, it's 2. Hi, Christopher, but we're not going to get to answer yours. Josh asked earlier about the participation dynamics canvas. I need to learn how to say that, to customers seeking support for a product or service. So just changing the context a little bit, how applicable would the framework be, or the canvas be, for seeking support for a product or service?
I mean, not immediately to me. Like, I think that you might, if you were a company looking to provide great support, you would probably recognize that the person seeking support is doing so in a context where they have some key relationships that really matter, where they are kind of acting on behalf of their organization and so on. But for the person who's like seeking support themselves, I don't know if this is a useful or relevant framework.
No.
But here you have another example of how it might change the thinking, right? Rather than thinking about the support, the support ticket creating user with the support system with the company, you would start thinking about, okay, where is this user in their organization? Who is asking for support? Who are their team members? And I know it's been really interesting to follow the Honeycomb story, because I know you guys think about this stuff. You think about how can team members actually, you have inadvertently or accidentally done this type of map, right? How can team members collaborate when incidents happen to understand and collectively do sense making like together, because you like people on call, for example, they're not alone.
Right, exactly, that shared view of the world, right? Like, can people get the state into their heads? And that goes both to mapping as well as to John Allspa's theory of kind of system understanding.
Yeah. And so this is like, there's both that system understanding and the sort of all the stuff above the line. And then you have this, okay, what are these actual relationships? Like, what are these actual interactions? Like, is the, you know, the person on call, if there is such a thing, right? Who do they contact, or who are they accountable to? And like, what actually happens here? And yeah, this is the type of visibility that you can start creating for yourself. And again, you can also put users in that are not actual users of your system. If you have a game like EVE Online, of course, you can start to map, you know, the relationship here between the corporation, like the, you know, directors and the regular line members and the different, you know, corporations and alliances in a coalition. And you can like start to map people in a very known system where every account is a user. But then again, in EVE Online, one user has multiple accounts, or one human has multiple accounts, and the most active humans have probably 20 plus, if I'm guessing. So you
can't see this, I'm glancing around the corner at my wife.
Yeah, so you have to take some care with this, but you can actually, yeah, map the relationships that matter. You maybe put your customer, for example, in one of these participation roles, and then you actually kind of ignore yourself for a moment and you try, just like you can wordly map a competitor, you can map the relationships that matter in the context of the user for the people or other agents that have nothing to do with your systems that are not users. And people have learned to map this when they're trying to sell, right? You, Damian, you work in sales, and you realize that sometimes you're talking to the person who's going to sign the PO. Sometimes you're talking to the people who are going to use it, and their relationships matters, and their relationship with executives matter. And you're actually acting in this kind of complex relationship map, and putting it on paper probably helps a lot.
It really does. And it was initially the relationship mapping. First was just, you know, org charts, but then of course you started to think about communication style. You started thinking about reporting chains. You started thinking about the fact that, yeah, some organizations are very big. I used to sell to development teams, so even if it was a large organization, it was a model I understood in most organizations. It then changes completely when maybe you have a role that is one person in a startup, but at Google is split into 15 people. And you have to be very targeted and understand exactly who you're talking to. So yeah, I would agree with that. Look, I hate to do this because yeah, we're over time. We've got 20 minutes in which I'd like Adrian, anybody else who's planning to join the fireside chat, to at least have a break for a drink, bio break, whatever that is. Thank you so much to all three speakers. That was an overwhelming hour and a half in terms of just how much good stuff there was. For me, you know, I hope that the questions and also the links and things will be available after this, because I know you've all gone in there and shared a few links. There are a few really interesting questions we couldn't get to, and some really nice comments as well that I think if you've taken the time to prepare and actually be here, it's nice just to see how your talk has landed. And it's gone really well. Just sort of reading through the comments and the support from everybody watching. Of course, that's a long hour and a half because of the fact that it's been so full, so packed. So thanks everybody who's joined as well and who's participated with questions and comments.
And thanks to you for running the whole day. That's a huge investment of time and stress and trying to keep on top of it. So you said you were going to take tomorrow off. I think that's well deserved.
Thank you.
Yeah, very much so.
Done a great job.
Appreciate it. Thanks, everyone.
Cheers, folks.
Thanks.